Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
It's time to do Revelation study number 23, which will be the 7th chapter of Zechariah. We're preparing ourselves to ultimately study the Revelation, which we will begin this fall. And when we get done with this chapter 7 of Zechariah, we're going to be halfway through the book of Zechariah, which means we've only got left to do Matthew chapter 24 before we get into the actual study of the Revelation. First 6 chapters of Zechariah were somewhat difficult. As you probably remember, the language was a bit obscure. We were looking at visions that, if we look at them in the structure of the order that they were given, pointed to Messiah. So much of what we're given in Zechariah fills in blanks when we get to the Revelation. Revelation says this will happen. Detail we find in Zechariah and we find in other of the prophets. These next chapters that we're going to get into, or we started in really last week, are oracles given by God directly to Zechariah, so the language in these is much, much more direct. And I want to begin this evening by going to Zechariah chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, please. It says, "In the 4th year of King Darius, on the 4th day of the 9th month, Kislev, a message from Adonai came to Zechariah. He sent, this is Adonai, I believe, doing this, sent Sarastzar and Regem Melech with his men to Beit El in order to ask Adonai's favor." Now, there's a little bit of doubt into that. It could well be that it was Zechariah that was involved in saying this, sending these men. But anyhow, we'll work our way through this. Verse 3, "As they inquired of the Kohanim of the house of Adonai Tzavaot and the prophets, should we go into mourning and abstain from pleasure during the 5th month, as we have been doing all of these years?" So what are they talking about when they're talking about shall we go into mourning and abstain from pleasure during the 5th month, as we've been doing all these years? Pinpointing, verse 1 there is pinpointing a time. The actual time that was given, this was given to Zechariah, and that date, if we took it to the Gregorian calendar, would be December 7th, 518 BCE. It's been almost 2 years since the first vision was given. And it says here that a word of God came to Zechariah. This language tells us this is an oracle that's being given to him, the transmission of a divine message directly to Zechariah. No intermediaries needed, no interpretation needed. The transmission of a divine message being given through a prophet. Verse 2 sets a situation which precedes the oracle. A group of people came to Beit El, Bethel in the English. So what does Beit El mean? Well, Beit El means house of God. This points to the temple of God, but Beit El was also an important city located about 12 miles north of Jerusalem. Beit El, I think, got its name because that's where the tabernacle of God was placed after they brought it in from the desert, before they moved everything into Jerusalem. This Beit El is actually in modern-day Shomron or Samaria. Beit El, though, had been a center of idol worship for the northern kingdom of Israel. After David created the united kingdom of Israel, his son Solomon took over, and later in Solomon's life, Solomon went about disobeying God in many ways, and because of this, the kingdom was actually split. The northern kingdom split away essentially from what was Judah, Benjamin, and Simeon, although Simeon was largely assimilated into Judah by that time. The north kept the name Israel. The north kept the name Israel, and the south became the kingdom of Judah, and Jerusalem and the temple, the house of God, Beit El, were in Judah. A king named Jeroboam took control of the northern kingdom, and there were never, ever a godly king in the northern kingdom. They were all having this problem in getting into a relationship with the God of Israel. Beit El had been an idolatrous city because of this. And to give us an idea of how idolatrous Beit El was, hold your place here in Zechariah 7:2 if you're looking in a Bible, and go to 1 Kings 12, please, verse 25. It says, "Then when Jeroboam built up Shechem in the hills of Ephraim and lived there. After that he left and built up Penuel. Nevertheless, Jeroboam said to himself, Now the rulership will return to the house of David, for if these people continue going up to offer sacrifices in the house of Adonai in Jerusalem, their hearts will turn back to their Lord. Rehoboam, king of Yehuda, Judah, then they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah." This is a king of Israel talking about doing something so that his people will quit crossing over into Judah and going to the temple of God, and ultimately abandoning him. Now, next. After seeking advice, the king made 2 calves of gold and said to the people, "You've been going up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Got to remember that the northern kingdom was pagan during its entirety. Here they've got 2 gold calves that they can worship. Verse 29, he placed one in Beit El, placed one at the house of God, placed one where the tabernacle had been when they first came in, that was now a town, and the other in Dan. Verse 30, "And the affair became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one in Beit El and all the way to Dan to worship the other. He also set up temples on the high places and made Kohanim, priests, from among all the people, even though they were not descended from the tribe of Levi." This was a bad place, this Beit El to the north of Jerusalem. Now back to Zechariah 7:2-3, please. We're going to say Zechariah sent Sharezer and Regem-Melech with his men to Beit El in order to ask Adonai's favor. As they inquired of the Kohanim of the house of Adonai Tzavaot and the prophets, "Should we go into mourning and abstain from pleasure during the 5th month as we have during all of these years?" See, the bit of confusion here is, where did they actually have gone? Could they go up to this pagan place, or did they go to the house of Adonai Tzavaot, an increase of the priests of temple? Now, this Beit El of Shomron, as we've described it so far this evening, was an idolatrous city. If so, what would the priests, why would there be any priests of our God? What would they be doing there in this idolatrous city? Or was this the house of God on the Temple Mount that they were in the process of rebuilding? See, this is occurring right after they have started coming back from the Babylonian exile, after Persia sent them back. And these priests of the house of God were the ones that returned from Persia as part of this. I believe that's where they went. Don't believe they were sent up the road to see the priests in the town of Beit El. They went to the house of God, to the temple in Jerusalem, right there where they were at. And the priests were there even though the temple rebuild was not yet completed. Now note that there were two men specifically named along with a group of other men, Shar-Etzer and Regem-Melech. It's generally believed that Shar-Etzer had some sign of really special standing within the community, but the name Regem-Melech speaks of royalty, someone of royal descent or somebody of high royal official perhaps, because Melech speaks to royalty. A Melech is a king in the Hebrew. After this introduction, the delegation comes to ask Adonai's favor. And the idea that's really afloat in all of this is that this action that they're doing now might perhaps persuade God to respond to the petitioner in some way that would change Adonai's anger to favor. This kind of raises a question of anger for the first time in there. They've come to ask God's favor. The priests and the prophets were the ones approached by the delegation. Reason for coming to them was at that time both the priests and the prophets in ancient Israel served the king by being a means of inquiry into God's will. A king would come to them and they would communicate what they wanted to God, and God would communicate back his will through them. What they were seeking was a ruling from God here on, should we continue as we've been doing for all these years, abstaining from pleasure during the 5th month and mourning? Now, the inquiry begins with should we. Note that it's designated to be answered simply either yes or no. And they've come to the priests. So why would you come to the priests? Because the priests had within this ritual vest that they put on, if you reached in from the side of it like this, there was a pocket in front here that had two pieces in it called the Urim and the Thummim. One was marked yes and one was marked no. And the priest blindly would reach inside there after you ask your question to see what God's answer was and pull out one of them, and it would be either yes or no, and whichever one that God put in his fingers was considered to be God's answer. That was what they were there for. All right. Give you a little example on this. 1 Samuel 23:9. David knew that Shaul was plotting something against him, so he told Aviatar the Cohen, bring the ritual vest here. Why did David say that? Bring the ritual vest here. Because if he brought the ritual vest here, it brought in the Urim and the Thummim so that they could get a yes or a no answer from God. Then David said, Adonai, God of Israel, your servant has certainly heard that Shaul, Saul, intends to come to Keilah and destroy the city just to get me. Next. Will the men of Keilah turn me over to him? Will Shaul, Saul, come down as your servant has heard? And Adonai, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And Adonai said he will. The priest reached in and he got a yes out of the vest, out of the Urim and the Thummim. Then David asked, will the men of Keilah hand me and my men over to Saul? And Adonai said, yes, they will. Again, because of the ritual vest involved, we know that they went to the Urim and the Thummim. Now, the pocket in there, these things were just rattling around loose in there. David asked this question, and he got an answer. Yes, they will turn them over to you. Saul will come down, yes. And this is what they were doing in Zechariah 7:3, asking, should we? They wanted an answer from the priest, from God, from the Urim and the Thummim. Question here is, should we go on mourning and abstain from pleasure in the 5th month as we have been doing for all these years? The mourning that's been spoken of here is a formalized public mourning related to fasting and the fact that it's related to fasting would require dietary restrictions on both food and drink, or both, to be part of the mourning. And the 5th month was the month that marked the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. You listening? The 5th month was the month that marked the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The temple was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. Again, Tisha B'Av still on the calendar. Tisha B'Av is the 9th day of the month of Av. It will begin at sundown. This Shabbat that's coming will be Tisha B'Av. And the Jewish community is obsessed with it, even though it should have stopped. The exiles that are asking this question had developed a program of weeping, fasting, and mourning that had been going on for 70 years. And the question before God is, can we change this behavior? Can we change this behavior now that we're back? Can we change this behavior? Do we have to do this anymore now that we're near the rededication of your temple as it's being rebuilt? They were looking for a yes and no answer, and they got more than they bargained for. Zechariah 7, 4, and 5, please. It was then that this message came to me, Zechariah from Adonai, Tzavaot 5. Speak to all the people of the land and to the Kohanim, the priests. Tell them when you fasted and mourned on the 5th and 7th months. He adds another one in there, not more than they're just asking about. When you fasted and mourned on the 5th and the 7th months throughout these 70 years, were you really fasting for me? Was it for me? Why were you doing this? Was this for me? They want a yes or no answer. Can we stop? He asks them this question. Wow. The answer came directly to Zechariah. It came in the form of a command, not only to speak to this delegation that was before him, but also to the priests and to all of the people of the land. And it wasn't a yes or no. God answers their question with a question and regulates the priest to part of the audience as part of this. The priests would not be the deliverers of this kind of an oracle. Only a prophet would. The priest could only do the Urim and the Thummim. So this came through Zechariah. Then it goes on to say, when you fasted and mourned, this combination of words is what is used when David and Bathsheba's son died. That same language is used. The son of David and Bathsheba from their affair, when he died, they used that language. 2 Samuel, please, 12:21. His servants ask him, what are you doing? That's just David. David's servants ask him, what are you doing? You fasted and wept for the child while it was alive, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat food. And he answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept because I thought maybe Adonai would show his grace to me and let the child live. This is the same kind of language that they've been using in what we're looking at in Zechariah 7. And they're asking God, can we stop this now? Same thought and form as those fasted and wept in Zechariah 7:4. This feasting and weeping was being done before the matter was settled, David is saying. Now that the matter is settled, I have to move forward. In Zechariah, is the matter settled as the temple is being rebuilt? That's their question. Lord, do we keep fasting now or do we move forward? And God doesn't respond as they thought. God says, wait a minute. Wait a minute. What's this fasting and mourning that you're talking about? Were you really fasting for me? In the 5th and 7th month, was it really me that you were fasting for? 5th month was for the destruction of the temple. 7th month was for the assassination of Gedaliah, the man who had been appointed governor over Judah by Nebuchadnezzar. He was assassinated by Judean nationalists as being a collaborator with Babylon. The reason that his being assassinated was mourned is it ended any semblance of Judean self-rule They were totally then under Babylon. There was nothing under their own control. The fast of Gedala, by the way, is still kept by some. It'll show up on your calendars between Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur. Tisha B'Av is the day on which both temples were destroyed. We mentioned that earlier, is still kept. Jews were expelled from Spain on Tisha B'Av 1492. Different year they were expelled from England. The delegation asked God if they needed to fast and mourn on Tisha B'Av in the 5th month, and God answered them by asking a question and upping the ante by adding the feast of Gedalah. Were you really fasting for me? To which I would say, oops, I think you've stepped on a toe here. God is ticked off about this. And just so we know, there were other fast days that were being kept in the same manner. Only 2 of them are mentioned here. One of those was mentioned by Sar Etzer and Regen Melech's committee. The other added to the conversation by God, by Adonai. The question is asked then by God, was it really me that you fasted and mourned for over these 70 years? See, this is an accusation. This is really an accusation. The accusation here is when you fast, it's no different than when you eat and drink. When you fast, it's no different than when you eat and drink. It's what you're really doing. You're doing what you please, to please yourselves, not for me. And we find this in 7:6, please. Rather, when you eat and drink, is it just to please yourself? Isn't it? That's the accusation that God's laid down on them. Are you really fasting for me? No, you're not. Rather, it's like when you eat and drink, it's just to please yourself, isn't it? Look at the contrast. The fasting and mourning of verse 5 is now contrasted with feasting and drinking. That's quite a condemnation. Now there's a tie-in here. The implication of feasting and drinking is that of a festival. What's being discussed in the fasting and mourning is a religious or spiritual activity. See, one's being feasting and drinking is a festival. Fasting and mourning is a religious or spiritual activity. If you put these 2 thoughts together, we have a religious festival involved. And that's what's being said. What God is accusing them of is that what they were doing wasn't for Him, but was to satisfy their own wants, and in the same manner, the feasting and mourning was no more than self-pity. Both of these were self-centered acts. The people had inaugurated fasts in response to certain events. God had not commanded the people to fast or mourn. God had not commanded the people to fast or mourn. They had created these themselves. Nor would He tell them to stop, because He was not really the beneficiary of such events. Zechariah 7:7. Isn't this just what Adonai proclaimed through the earlier prophets when Jerusalem was inhabited and prosperous, as were the cities around her, the Negev and the Siphelah inhabited? This is pointing to the south, to the Negev and the Siphelah, to the north. This is talking about the whole of Israel being inhabited. This is the same thing that we've just looked at, is what Adonai proclaimed through the earlier prophets. God's saying, isn't this something that's already been discussed? Back when Jerusalem was an inhabited city, when Israel was prosperous, the implication in the Hebrew for what is being translated here is prosperity is security. Security is paramount in the thought here. Jerusalem gave the appearance of security because of the walls around it. And the last part of this verse sets out the boundaries of Judah on the eve of its destruction. Why was Israel destroyed? They had turned away from God to their own interests. And what were they doing here with this fasting and mourning that they were doing on their own, that they had set up? God hadn't told them to do that, so they had turned away from God and done something to their own interests. And God's saying, don't do this. Don't you remember when you did this before, did things that were of your own interests instead of what I wanted you to do? You ended up thrown out. Implications here is that fasting and mourning is also of their own interest. And God's saying, you're asking me about this fasting and mourning? Don't ask me. I'm no more involved in this fasting and mourning than I was in your lives before the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. That's a pretty strong accusation there. Remember that God had left the temple before the temple was destroyed the first time. And you also need to know that during the duration of the second temple, he never came back and inserted himself into the temple. Even Yeshua never physically entered the temple in his first ministry. God left the temple because of their own self-interest and turned them from him. Their own self-interest had turned them from him to pagan idolatry in his own temple precincts, and so God abandoned them. God's saying, you're asking me if you should continue something that you started doing out of your own self-interest that doesn't involve me. I'm not going to say yes or no. Only that you should remember what you did in your own self-interest that didn't involve me and what the results were. Zechariah 7, 8, and 9. Then this message came from Adonai to Zechariah. In the past, Adonai Sevaot said, administer true justice, let everybody show mercy and compassion to his brothers. Verse 8 is really the same as verse 4 in the fact that it's introducing another oracle. We're changing our subject here. This message from Adonai came to Zechariah. In the past, Adonai Sevaot said, administer true justice, let everyone show mercy and compassion to his brother. Verse 9 introduces two positive precepts. The first of 4 precepts. 2 introduced here, 2 more will follow that will be negative. Administer true justice or complete justice and show mercy and compassion. Mercy and compassion. This first part speaks to social justice and harmony from a proper action between individuals. Social justice and harmony. True justice or complete justice. Second part of this is to show mercy. The kind of mercy meant here is love. Requires one to love tenderly, kind of total love. Mercy where compassion really becomes part of this love. Compassion and mercy to one's fellow human being. Loyal love and mercy. At the beginning of verse 9 it says, in the past. Those words actually aren't in the Hebrew, they're added. In the past has been added. They're not in the Hebrew. But the inference in the Hebrew of that is there. That we're still referring to the prophets of verse 7 when Jerusalem was still inhabited. That's speaking of the past. We have an example of what these prophets were saying actually in Micah. Micah was a prophet of the era that we're talking about. So let's go to Micah 6:8. Human being, you have already been told what is good, what God demands of you. No more than to act justly, love grace, and walk in purity with your God. You have already been told. God doesn't change. This isn't something new that's popped up here. It isn't something new that popped up in Zechariah. God doesn't change. It isn't a suggestion either. This is what Adonai demands of us, actually, of all of us. What we're seeing is the kind of interpersonal relationships that God demands that we have. See, wouldn't it be nice if everybody in the body of Messiah read and understood this passage, that God demands that we have this kind of interpersonal relationship? I want to take this to what Yeshua taught. There's no change in what Yeshua taught on this subject. In fact, there is no change ever in anything that Yeshua taught. He said, I didn't come to change anything, I came to fulfill. Let's go to John chapter 13, verse 34. Yeshua speaking, I'm giving you a new command. New command is a translator goof, I think. I'm giving you a new command that you keep on loving each other in the same way that I have loved you. You are also to keep on loving each other. Everyone will know that you are my Talmudim, my disciples, by the fact that you have love for each other. See, this is not a new command. This is something that we've looked at in Micah, that we've looked at in Zechariah, that Yeshua is passing on to his disciples. This phrase, new command, in this translation is based on an idiom meaning a fresh concept. A fresh concept. I wish they'd put the idiom in the translation, actually. Yeshua is giving them a command that is a fresh concept to them. It looks like this is a fresh concept to every new generation. Oh, really? Yeah, I guess so. We should love each other. New concept, fresh concept every generation. And God's having to remind the people in Zechariah of what was less than 100 years old, because Micah had told him the same thing. Micah told him the same thing, that Adonai demanded that they love each other, and Yeshua is putting it on a different level. He's saying, you know what? You can tell people you're my disciples, but the only way that they're going to know whether you are or not is by your fruit, and that fruit is, do you love one another? In other words, if you don't love one another, you can't prove that you're my disciples, and it probably means that you're not, actually. That's a pretty hefty whack on the knuckles that he's given them. There is a litmus test for being a disciple of Yeshua. We have to love one another. Whether we like each other or not, we've got to love each other. Israel had a unique responsibility as a chosen people. They were to be witness to the Goyim, to the Gentiles. And how were the Goyim, the Gentiles, going to know that Israel was the chosen people and Adonai was the Most High God? How were they to show this? By their love for one another is what this boils down to. The fact that Israel does justly, that they love mercy, that they walk humbly before their God. That's what this is talking about. Zechariah 7:10, please. Don't oppress widows, orphans, foreigners, or poor people. Don't plot evil against each other. See, there are the two negative precepts that we mentioned earlier, the don'ts. This verse is directed towards the exploitation of the weak or of someone's weaknesses. The term oppress here usually involves economic oppression caused either through violence or fraud or injustice. The thought here is actually that if you're doing this, you bear down hard on a person, that you grind them down, you just wear them down. And the opposite of that is mercy. And that's what we're supposed to have instead of doing this, is we're supposed to have mercy. Often this would be done, this grinding down of people, by withholding compensation to the poor, perhaps for work done. Maybe an unfair barter because of circumstances. This speaks to the widow and the orphan. These are commonly known as the weaker members of society, usually lacking in property, social status, and income. These are the ones that need special consideration both in economic and legal matters. And then there's the foreigners and the poor. The foreigners and the poor. So many of Israel looked upon anybody that wasn't one of them as being so inferior. Let's identify the foreigner here, though, as a sojourner, a ger. The foreigner is someone who comes in and does business and leaves, doesn't hang around. The sojourner or the ger is a Gentile who's chosen to live among Israel, to be part of their community and worship Israel's God. That was a social position. And there was some balance problems between the native and the sojourner. Living among the native-born, the gers, the sojourners, safety depended on the native-born with whom he lived. And this could be a struggle if the native-born chose not to love him. And what's Yeshua's instructions? Anybody that is living with you or being part of you to worship me, you are to love them. You are to love them. But this could be a struggle if the native-born chose not to love the ger. The poor, even though they were natives, were no better off. All of these mentioned were in very tenuous position, very weak position economically and socially. And then the verse ends with the second thou shalt not. Don't plot evil against each other. Don't plot against each other. This has to be a thing of the heart. This has to be a thing of the heart. The very thought of wrongdoing is forbidden. And this might include bringing false accusations. We'll expand on false accusations in the next couple of chapters. Yeshua spoke to things that are done in the heart. So I want to take us to Matthew. I'm going to look at two different sections in Matthew 5. We'll begin in Matthew 5:21. You have heard that our fathers were told, do not murder. And anyone who commits murder will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who nurses anger against his brother will be subject to judgment. That whoever calls his brother you good for nothing will be brought before the Sanhedrin. That whoever says fool incurs the penalty of burning in the fire of Gehenna. We're not only not supposed to murder anybody, we're not even supposed to think about it or speak about it or say anything of that nature. Somebody cuts you off at a traffic light and you swear at them and put a curse on them. God says, whoops, you're in trouble. That's not what I want of you. That's not what I want of you. Matthew 5:27. You have heard that our fathers were told, do not commit adultery, but I tell you that a man who even looks at a woman with the purpose of lusting after her has already committed adultery in his heart. He who hates his brother is guilty of murder. Looking in lust is guilty of adultery. This is saying then those that are fasting and mourning should be practicing this level of moral standings. We shouldn't be fasting and mourning because they destroyed our temple. We should be in prayer for them that they come to know our God and come into salvation and maybe come back and help us stack up the new temple. What Yeshua talked about in Matthew 5 is what God is talking about in Zechariah. You come here and fast and mourn for these things of the 5th month and the 7th month. It was a breakdown of these moral standards that caused the destruction of the temple of Judah. It was the breakdown of these moral standards that we just went through that caused the temple to be destroyed, God to leave the temple, for Jerusalem and Judah to be destroyed. And you come here and fast and mourn because the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. No, you don't get the point. You don't get the point. It was a breakdown of these moral standards that caused the destruction of Judah and the horrendous judgment of the Jewish people that you're mourning about, is what he's saying. Zechariah 7:11, please. But he says, I came with my prophets, I talked to my prophets, I did all these things, but they wouldn't listen. They stubbornly turned their shoulder away and stopped up their ears so that they wouldn't have to hear it. Yes, they made their hearts as hard as a diamond so that they wouldn't hear the Torah and the messages that Adonai Tzavaot had sent by his Spirit through the earlier prophets. This is why great anger came from Adonai Tzavaot. This is why you ended up in the Babylonian exile. And you're doing the same thing again. Wow. The vivid description here is of Israel's refusal to obey God's word. And the words wouldn't listen and stopped up their ears. We have the description of a failure to do God's will.